Night falls on Windsor Great Park. Through the trees, a single royal house glows like a ghost that refuses to leave. This is the tragic story of Prince Andrew's most scandalous mansion, Royal Lodge, a $30 million home on nearly 100 acres of land that now feels less like a palace and more like a trap. Imagine a house that costs up to $5 million a year just to keep alive to stop the roof from leaking, the paint from cracking, and the gardens from turning into a jungle. Now, imagine the prince who lives there, with no official royal job, no public salary. What a reputation shattered by one of the worst scandals in modern royal history. Outside the gates, public anger simmers. Inside, the bills keep growing. Pressure from the palace is rising. And the man in the middle refuses to move out of the home he calls his last safe place. But why is Andrew fighting so hard to lock himself inside this house? What secret deals, family promises, and hidden fears are buried under Royal Lodge's perfect lawns? And how long can one mansion hold up an entire royal scandal before it finally collapses? If you enjoy deep dives into gilded architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. The day the gates closed. It's autumn of 2022. The gates are shut, security vans idling at the perimeter. Beyond the iron bars, the house looks calm. White walls, dark windows, old trees standing guard as they always have. But something is different. The news vans arrived first, then the photographers, then the headlines, each sharper than the last. Prince steps back. Duke loses titles. Royal Lodge future? Unclear. Inside, life continues in careful silence. Staff move through the corridors, dogs sleep on antique sofas. The kitchen still prepares 3 meals a day, yet everyone knows the protective bubble has burst. This isn't a sudden collapse. Royal Lodge has been sinking for years. Quietly, politely, the way old houses do when no one wants to admit the foundations are failing. The removal vans outside aren't here to strip the rooms yet. They're a precaution, an insurance policy, a warning that what once felt permanent might not survive much longer. For decades, this house stood for comfort. It was a place where royals could drop the mask and be almost ordinary, walk the dogs, read the newspapers, eat breakfast without cameras watching. King George VI loved it. Queen Mother made it her home for half a century. A young Elizabeth played in the garden and tasted what a normal childhood might feel like, even though hers could never truly be normal. Then Andrew took the lease, spent millions renovating, raised his daughters here, and tried to build a life he believed no scandal could ever touch. He was wrong. Now the house that once symbolized royal warmth has become something very different. A fortress where a prince hides from consequences. A mansion that costs far too much for a man with almost no visible income, and a lightning rod that stirs public anger every time his name appears in the news. The question everyone asks seems simple: why doesn't he just leave? The answer sits tangled in lease agreements, family loyalty, personal pride, and a lifetime of believing that royal status means never having to say you were wrong. But to understand how Royal Lodge turned into the most toxic address on the royal estate, you have to go back not just to the scandal, not even to Andrew's first day in the house. You have to go back to when this place was built and see what it was always meant to be. A hiding place. A retreat for people who needed to escape the weight of the crown without surrendering it completely. A soft landing for royals who couldn't quite manage palace life but still deserved comfort and privacy. For 2 centuries, that arrangement worked. Kings and queens came here to rest. Lovers met in secret. Widows mourned in peace. The house absorbed their stories without judgment. But Royal Lodge was never designed to shelter someone the country once held to account. It was never meant to be the backdrop for a clash where privilege and scandal collide so loudly that the walls themselves seem stained. And it was certainly not built to withstand the kind of modern scrutiny that turns every detail, every unpaid bill. Every closed curtain, every refusal to move out into a symbol of everything people think is broken about inherited power. The gates are still closed. The house is still standing. But from the outside, the siege has begun. Royal Lodge wasn't always like this. For 200 years, it served a simpler purpose. A place where royals could drop the performance and just breathe. No cameras, no rigid protocol, just family. The scandal came later. The King's Cottage. Royal Lodge began as something no one would have called a mansion. In 1662, it was a simple keeper's lodge, a working building in Windsor Great Park where staff lived while managing the royal hunting grounds. Small rooms, low ceilings, built for function, not for show. For more than a century, it stayed that way. Royals rode past it on hunts but never thought to live there. It was too plain, too far from the palace, too ordinary. Then, in 1812, the Prince Regent, the future George IV, noticed it. He was already turning Brighton into his fantasy palace and remaking Windsor Castle into a Gothic fortress. Yet he saw potential in the little lodge tucked among the trees. He ordered it expanded. New wings, more rooms, classical proportions, cottage large enough for a king, but still small enough to feel private. The work took years. By the time it was finished, Royal Lodge had turned into something between a country house and a royal retreat, comfortable but not grand. George IV used it from time to time. His brother William IV preferred other estates. The house drifted in and out of use, hosting minor royals and guests who needed somewhere quiet to stay. Then came Queen Victoria. She didn't live at Royal Lodge, but she understood exactly what it was for. Windsor Castle was for state business. Royal Lodge was for escape. She let family members use it when they needed distance from court pressures. The pattern was set. Royal Lodge became the place you went when the palace felt too heavy, when you wanted your children to play in a garden that felt almost normal. It was never about grandeur. It was about relief. By the early 1900s, the house had settled into a rhythm. It hosted younger royals and lesser titles. The rooms were comfortable, the grounds beautiful, but not overly formal. It felt more like a large family home than an official royal address. Staff who worked there later remembered it as one of the easier postings. Less ceremony, fewer rules. Royals who stayed there tended to relax. They ate simpler meals, dressed more casually, laughed louder. The house absorbed that mood. Within the family, it became known as a safe place, somewhere you could admit you were tired or unsure without it instantly turning into a scandal. That reputation would prove crucial in 1931. King George V was on the throne, but his second son, Prince Albert, the Duke of York, was struggling. He was shy, nervous, and crushed by a stammer that turned public speaking into torture. His older brother, the future Edward VIII, was charismatic and confident. Albert felt like the backup, the lesser son. He needed a home where he didn't have to perform every minute. George V offered him Royal Lodge. Albert accepted. He moved in with his wife Elizabeth and their two young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. The family that would define the next era of Royal Lodge had arrived. For Albert, the house became a refuge. He could practice his speeches in private and walk the grounds without courtiers watching his every move. His daughters ran wild in the garden. They climbed trees, built forts, played with... Welcome to the Queen Mother's garden. In 1936, Albert became king, not by choice, but because his brother, Edward VIII, abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. Suddenly, the shy, stammering Duke was King George VI, ruler of an empire that still stretched over a quarter of the globe. He was terrified. The palace tried to prepare him, with coaches and carefully crafted scripts, but the weight of the crown was immense. George VI felt like an understudy, pushed onto the stage on opening night with no rehearsal. Royal Lodge became his anchor. Even as king, he refused to give it up. Buckingham Palace was for work, Windsor Castle for state occasions, but Royal Lodge was home. It was the only place he could stop pretending he had everything under control. His wife, Queen Elizabeth, understood this perfectly. She turned the house into a fortress of normality, with Sunday lunches, garden picnics, and evening walks. The girls, Elizabeth and Margaret, still climbed the same trees and wore the same muddy boots. Back in 1932, people of Wales had given Princess Elizabeth a gift that would define Royal Lodge for generations. A miniature house called Y Bwthyn Bach, the little cottage. It sat in the garden, a perfect replica of a Welsh cottage, scaled down to child size. It had 2 small rooms, working doors and windows, and even a tiny kitchen with running water. For Elizabeth and Margaret, it was their private kingdom. It's the only space where they had complete control, where being a princess didn't matter and no one was watching. That little house is still there today. When war came in 1939, Royal Lodge became a hiding place. George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London during the Blitz, but they sent the princesses to Windsor Castle for safety. Royal Lodge sat empty for months at a time, shuttered and dark. After air raids, the family would retreat there to recover. The house had no strategic value. Just quiet rooms where a king could stop performing courage for a few hours and finally admit he was exhausted. Staff remembered the king pacing the halls late at night, smoking too much, worrying about his country and his daughters. Royal Lodge gave him the space to fall apart in private so he could hold himself together in public. The war ended, Britain survived, and George VI had proven stronger than anyone expected, but the effort had destroyed his health. He died suddenly in his sleep in 1952. His wife Elizabeth became the Queen Mother overnight. Her daughter was now Queen Elizabeth II. The old life was gone. She could have moved anywhere, but she chose Royal Lodge. She stayed for 50 years. The house that had sheltered a nervous father now sheltered a grieving widow. She kept his rooms almost exactly as he had left them, his books on the shelves, his favorite chair by the window. The garden became her obsession. She widened the flower beds and added new paths, slowly turning the grounds into one of the most beautiful private gardens in England. The little Welsh cottage remained, and her grandsons Charles, Andrew, and Edward played there, just as their mother had. Royal Lodge became a living memory, a place where the Queen Mother could hold on to the life she had lost. By her 90s, the house and the woman were inseparable. She was always there until she passed away in 2002. The Queen Mother died in March 2002 at 101 years old. Royal Lodge, her home for half a century, stood empty. The family had to decide its fate. Some suggested a museum, others wanted to split it into apartments. Queen Elizabeth II had a different idea. She offered it to her second son, Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. Andrew was 52, divorced from Sarah Ferguson for 6 years, and living a fragmented life between a palace apartment and a country house he still shared with his ex-wife. His daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, were growing up split between parents and locations. Andrew wanted stability for them, a permanent home. Royal Lodge looked perfect. The Queen offered him a 75-year lease. The terms were generous. Andrew would pay just £250 a week in rent. In return, he would personally finance a massive renovation, new roofs, updated wiring, restored stonework, costing a reported £7.5 million. Andrew paid it, viewing it as an investment in legacy. This wasn't just a house. It was where his grandmother had lived and his mother had played. He moved in during 2004, and surprisingly, Sarah Ferguson moved in with him. On paper, they were divorced, but they had never truly separated. Royal Lodge became the physical proof of their strange but loyal partnership. Two people who couldn't stay married but couldn't let go. Living together inside a mansion that felt like its own sealed world, the girls loved it. After growing up under the harsh glare of tabloid headlines at Royal Lodge, they could disappear. They rode horses, walked the dogs, and played in the same garden cottage their grandmother had 70 years earlier. For Andrew, the house felt like redemption. His Navy career was over, his marriage had collapsed, and the press had been brutal. Royal Lodge was meant to rewrite. Royal Lodge wasn't just a house. It was a promise. A sanctuary tucked inside Windsor Great Park, grand, traditional, and wrapped in centuries of royal memory. When Prince Andrew moved in, he came with confidence, money, and the quiet belief that his life would always run on royal rails. He earned from book deals, public appearances, and investments, all supplemented by a royal allowance. Enough, he believed, to carry the weight of a great estate. Enough to make Royal Lodge his own. The house was once filled with laughter, visiting cousins, and royal celebrations during the Queen Mother's era. Soft florals, pastel wallpapers, and gentle carpets defined its atmosphere, but slowly, almost without him noticing, Andrew repainted those memories. Heavy furniture replaced the gentle florals. Darker shades washed out the Queen Mother's cheerful palette. One era was quietly erased to make way for another. And then came the Lease 75-year deal built on unusual, almost secretive rules. The rent was a bargain, just £250 per week, but it came with a massive catch. The tenant, Prince Andrew, was responsible for funding all major repairs. He couldn't sublet the property. He couldn't sell the lease. And any inheritance of it required the Crown Estate's approval. It was a golden cage. The low rent was exchanged for massive responsibility. Andrew had to restore everything. The roofs, the plumbing, the electricity, the stonework. Millions of pounds of work for a house he did not even own. These were million-pound problems hidden behind royal wallpaper. Still, while his allowance flowed, the numbers looked manageable. His life inside the house looked stable, even comfortable. Inside, a unique situation unfolded. The arrangement: Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, divorced, yet living together. They occupied separate wings, but shared meals. They led independent lives, but were connected by daily routines. Staff whispered about the arrangement. Guests found it odd. But for their daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, it was simply home, a real home. Royal Lodge had seen far worse in its history-drunken royals, secret marriages, scandals, and affairs. Compared to all that, this arrangement seemed almost ordinary. The house absorbed everything: companionship, loneliness, ego, and ambition without complaint. But beneath the carpets and the stone, the cracks were starting to grow. By 2015, Royal Lodge had become Andrew's entire world. Days began with dogs weaving through antique rooms, shedding hair onto carpets once kept pristine. He'd have breakfast with Sarah at a small table, surrounded by newspapers, quiet conversations, and familiar routines. They were a divorced couple, acting more married than many who were. The garden cottage, where the little princesses once played, stood as a time capsule. Its small chairs and tiny cupboards formed a miniature kingdom frozen in time. Beatrice and Eugenie returned often, not as royal figures, but as daughters. This place preserved their childhoods. To the girls, Royal Lodge meant safety. To Andrew, it meant proof that he still mattered. He filled the walls with photographs of himself with world leaders in uniform and with his daughters. Every frame reinforced the story he clung to: I still belong. I still matter. Maintaining Royal Lodge required a full team: gardeners, cooks, housekeepers, ground staff, and security officers. It cost hundreds of thousands of pounds each year just to keep the estate looking effortless. Yet, fewer guests were coming. There were fewer official engagements, fewer invitations. Once Andrew had represented Britain abroad, now even simple ribbon-cutting events were sparse. Royal Lodge became his throne, even as the kingdom outside stopped listening. Inside, he still felt royal. Outside, opinions were changing. Old houses never stopped bleeding money. Roofs, stonework, heating, drainage, the aging systems demanded millions in repairs. But Andrew didn't have millions anymore. His allowance covered his routine life, not the building's structural decay. He had tied his identity to a house he could not afford, a house he could not sell, a house he was legally bound to maintain. Royal Lodge didn't just shelter Andrew, it owned him. The trouble began with small crack stories in the tabloids, whispers about business friends with murky pasts, and photos that raised eyebrows. Individually, each scandal seemed survivable. They were embarrassing, but manageable. Andrew dismissed them as media attacks. Staff, however, saw the signs: a short temper, long silences, and hours spent locked away, reading newspapers like battle reports. Sarah defended him. His daughters stayed loyal. The Queen remained silent. Andrew mistook that silence for approval, but really, it was distance. Then came the Epstein connection. Photographs captured handshakes and introductions in private rooms. The most damaging image showed them walking together in Central Park after Epstein's conviction. Andrew claimed he went there to end the friendship face to face. But his critics saw something else entirely: loyalty to the wrong man. The bubble around him shook, but it did not burst. Not yet. Security at the estate was also failing. In 2013, an intruder scaled the fence. In 2016, another wandered the grounds. Andrew demanded higher fences, more cameras, and more guards. The Crown Estate refused, stating that Royal Lodge was not a fortress. There were cracks in the house, cracks in his finances, and cracks in his reputation. The storm was gathering. Sarah struggled with her own debts. Old friends started declining invitations. Dinner conversations looped back to bitterness about the unfair media, bad advisors, and an ungrateful public. Beatrice and Eugenie worried. They could see the house draining their father, emotionally, financially, and socially. New maintenance estimates soared. Another £5 million were required. Andrew didn't have it. The lease that once felt like a form of protection had become a trap. Then came 2019, the year everything fell apart. Virginia Giuffre filed a lawsuit in the United States. It contained specific allegations, with specific dates and specific encounters. This time, the bubble didn't just crack, exploded. The Royal Lodge saga is a story that feels like it's straight out of a modern-day feudal drama. You have a fortress, a defiant prince, and a new king determined to restore order to his realm. But this isn't a medieval tale. It's a very real, very public, and very messy standoff happening right now within the House of Windsor. And at the heart of it all is a 30-room mansion and a piece of paper, a lease agreement that has become Prince Andrew's last line of defense. So how did we get here? How did a royal residence become the symbol of a family's deepest crisis? Let's rewind a bit. After the disastrous BBC Newsnight interview in 2019 and the subsequent legal battles, Prince Andrew was effectively stripped of his royal duties and patronages. He became a ghost at the royal feast, present but unseen, his name a stain on the institution. King Charles, upon taking the throne, made it clear that a slimmed-down, cost-effective monarchy was his top priority. That meant every expense, every property, and every royal was under scrutiny. And Andrew, living in the sprawling, expensive royal lodge, was a glaring anomaly. The obvious solution, from the palace's perspective, was for Andrew to move out, to pack up and relocate to the smaller, more modest Frogmore cottage, recently vacated by Harry and Meghan. It seemed logical. It seemed necessary, but Andrew said no, absolutely not. That's where the real problem began. You see, the lease on Royal Lodge is, for lack of a better word, ironclad. It was signed in 2003, a different era entirely. It grants Andrew the right to live there for 75 years, as long as he maintains the property and pays a modest weekly rent.
Ow.
When this lease was drafted, no one could have possibly imagined a scenario where a senior royal would be exiled from public life but still hold the keys to one of the Crown Estate's prime properties. The lawyers combed through the documents, looking for a loophole, a clause, anything that would allow the king to simply evict his brother. But there was nothing. Andrew hadn't technically broken the terms of the agreement. For the public, this felt utterly absurd. A legal technicality was protecting a disgraced prince, allowing him to cling to a life of luxury he no longer represented. For King Charles, it was a source of deep and growing frustration. How could he modernize the monarchy when his own brother was holding it hostage with a decades-old contract? But for Andrew, that piece of paper was everything. It was his shield, his security, his fortress. As long as the paperwork held, Royal Lodge was his. He couldn't be forced out. So, with a direct approach blocked, the palace shifted its strategy. If they couldn't break down the door, they would lay siege to the castle. It became a quiet, grinding war of attrition. The first and most powerful weapon was money. Andrew's annual allowance, a substantial sum from the late Queen, was cut. Suddenly, the enormous running costs of a 30-room mansion, the heating, the electricity, the staff, and crucially, the repairs became a very big problem. The house itself was beginning to show its age. Reports started to surface of damp, peeling paint, and a roof in desperate need of millions of pounds worth of repairs. Under the terms of the lease, these were Andrew's responsibility. But without his income, how could he possibly pay for it? The palace's calculus was simple. Squeeze him financially until staying becomes untenable. Make the fortress so expensive and uncomfortable to maintain that he'd have no choice but to surrender and accept the keys to Frogmore Cottage. Alongside the financial pressure was the relentless weight of public opinion. Every newspaper article, every TV documentary, every social media post was a fresh stone thrown at the walls of his sanctuary. He was a national punchline, a symbol of royal excess and scandal. The hostility was palpable. This wasn't just a family squabble. It was a public spectacle, and the audience was growing increasingly impatient. Royal Lodge was no longer just a home. It was the battleground for this silent, slow-motion conflict. Inside, life for Prince Andrew reportedly took on a strange, suspended quality. He was trapped. He'd cling to the routines of a life that was slipping through his fingers. There were morning walks with his dogs across the beautiful but deteriorating grounds. There were long, lonely hours spent in his study, surrounded by books on military history, a painful reminder of the honorary titles he'd been forced to surrender. He'd make phone calls to friends and advisors, but what advice could they really give? The situation was unprecedented. Living there with him was his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson. Fergie, more than anyone, understood public humiliation. She had been through her own scandals and had somehow managed to rebuild her life. She was a constant, loyal presence for Andrew. But even she could reportedly see that this was different. This wasn't a storm you could simply wait out. This was a slow, deliberate erasure from the life he had always known. The longer he stayed, the more isolated he became. By the middle of 2023, the atmosphere inside Royal Lodge was described as almost haunted. Imagine those long, empty corridors. Dust gathering on tables in rooms that were once filled with laughter and royal gatherings. Lights being kept off to save money, plunging parts of the vast house into shadow. It had become a monument not to royal prestige, but to a prince's spectacular fall from grace, a man trapped in the gilded wreckage of his own decisions. It was a lonely, quiet, and decaying existence. But Andrew, whether out of stubborn pride, a genuine belief in his rights, or simple fear of what leaving would mean, refused to budge. He was playing the only card he had left. He held the keys. He held the lease. And in his mind, that was enough. He was Prince Andrew, the son of a queen, and this was his home. He wasn't going anywhere. But outside the gates, forces were gathering that no lease could hold back forever. The pressure wasn't just coming from the palace anymore. It started coming from Parliament, with questions being asked about the propriety of the situation. Public outrage, fueled by a cost-of-living crisis, was making the image of a non-working royal in a 30-room mansion look worse by the day. And above it all was King Charles, a new monarch trying to stamp his authority on the institution. His patience, it was clear, was wearing thin. The Andrew problem was a direct challenge to his vision and his rule. Royal Lodge was no longer just a decaying house. It had become the focal point of a constitutional showdown. It was one man's defiant determination to stay put versus an entire institution as desperate need to move on. The old, fragile walls of the mansion seemed to absorb the tension. The cracks weren't just in the plaster anymore. They were in the delicate balance between a private individual's legal rights and the public's expectation of a modern monarchy.
The siege, quiet but relentless, continued.
Every news report of a leaky roof, every whisper of the king's displeasure, was another turn of the screw. It's a standoff that can't last forever. Something has to give. The pressure is building, and the breaking point feels closer than ever. The final chapter in the story of Prince Andrew and Royal Lodge is yet to be written. But it's clear that the silent, grinding battle for this royal fortress. Each royal agreement comes with its own set of duties and expectations. The system is a patchwork, shaped more by tradition, negotiation, and family politics than by a single clear policy. Andrew's removal has dragged this entire system into the light. People are now asking questions that once seemed impolite. How much does it cost to run these places? Who pays the bills? If a royal stops working, should they immediately lose their home, or is there a middle ground? There are no easy answers because the rules have always been flexible, applied case by case, and adjusted based on family dynamics and public opinion. Royal Lodge has become a test case for whether these old, quiet arrangements can survive modern scrutiny. The Crown Estate's position suggests they can't, at least not without some serious changes. Royal homes now need a justification, a public benefit, a clear purpose. Andrew offered none of these. Some critics argue the whole system is fundamentally flawed. Why should anyone live in a mansion just because of their birth? Why should taxpayers fund security and maintenance for people who do nothing in return? Others defend the tradition. They argue that the monarchy has always included non-working relatives, and these royal houses carry symbolic weight, help preserve history, and can't be measured just by profit and loss. Royal Lodge sits right at the center of this debate. The house itself is a Grade 2 listed building, legally protected as historic. It can't be demolished or significantly altered without permission. Its physical survival isn't in question. So what's next? The Crown Estate has options. It could lease it to another family member under stricter terms. It could open parts of it for public tours. They could use it for official events. They could leave it empty for a while as they rethink their entire approach to royal housing. Whatever they choose will signal what kind of monarchy Britain wants, one that clings to tradition. One that acts like a business, or something in between that preserves history but demands accountability. Andrew's lease belonged to an older way of thinking. Low rent, little oversight, and a quiet assumption that status lasts forever. That mindset is dying, and Royal Lodge is its clearest casualty. The house will endure. It's already survived 3 centuries of wars, abdications, and family dramas. But whoever moves in next will find the rules have changed. Royal Lodge will never again be someone's private kingdom, shielded from outside questions. The walls are the same, the gardens are still beautiful, but its meaning has shifted. It's no longer a symbol of royal comfort, but a warning about royal accountability. It's gone from a safe haven to a cautionary tale. Royal Lodge has been many things. A keeper's cottage, a romantic retreat, a family home for a reluctant king, a widow's sanctuary, and a divorced prince's last fortress. Now it's an empty mansion waiting for its next chapter. Each generation has reimagined it, and that pattern will continue. The only question is what shape it takes next. The Crown Estate is weighing its options. One is to lease it to another working royal with a new, stricter contract. Princess Anne's name comes up, but she's famously practical and doesn't need another house. Edward and Sophie are another possibility, but moving them might seem like just shuffling pieces on a board. A second option is to open Royal Lodge to the public in a limited way-guided tours garden access in the summer. This has been done with other royal properties like Frogmore House. It would help offset maintenance costs and signal transparency. But this isn't simple. Royal Lodge is deep inside Windsor Great Park, making public access and security a complex and expensive challenge. A third option is to repurpose it purely for official use. Receptions, state visit accommodation, or discreet meetings. This aligns with King Charles's vision of a slimmed-down monarchy where property serves the institution, not individual comfort. It would disconnect the house from any single family member's conduct. A fourth, more radical option is to lease it to someone outside the royal family entirely. While not impossible, it would feel like a retreat, an admission that some royal properties are now too expensive to justify as royal homes. And if one house goes, people will start asking which one is next. For now, Royal Lodge is in limbo. Skeleton staff keeps it going, but it has no resident and no clear future. It's been in this situation before, drifting and half forgotten. The house has always survived by adapting and attaching itself to people who needed what it offered. The problem now is, it's not clear if any modern royal needs or can justify what Royal Lodge offers. A 30-room mansion that costs millions a year to maintain. Royal Lodge was built for a world where royals needed secluded retreats to disappear from public view, where sprawling estates were normal and a title opened every door. That world is gone. The house will likely survive as a historic building, but perhaps as something entirely different. Maybe it will become just a beautiful, costly monument to a system that took too long to figure out its place in the modern world. But this isn't just Andrew's story. It's a mirror held up to a system that protects status over service and takes decades to admit what everyone already knows. Andrew's mistake wasn't loving the house. It was believing the house made him untouchable. He spent 20 years treating it as proof of his importance, even as his reputation collapsed. The public saw a man hiding behind walls, clinging to symbols he hadn't earned. The standoff revealed a fundamental truth. Titles don't protect you from consequences, they just delay them. For the monarchy, getting Andrew out was about survival and proving the institution could hold its own accountable. But the lesson is bigger than one prince and one mansion. Most of us will never live in a royal lodge, but many of us know what it feels like to hold on to something past its time, a job that no longer fits, a relationship that's over, a version of ourselves that no longer matches reality. Andrew's real tragedy wasn't losing the house. It was wasting years fighting a battle he'd already lost, pouring money he didn't have into a place. By early 2024, the walls around Royal Lodge weren't just made of bricks anymore. They were made of pressure. Political pressure. Public pressure. The pressure of an institution struggling to prove it still had moral weight. Then, the announcement came, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a short, dry statement from Buckingham Palace. Prince Andrew would be required to leave Royal Lodge. No emotion. No justification. Just a line drawn in royal ink. For Andrew, it was unthinkable. And the 75-year lease he thought was his fortress was suddenly fragile. The Crown Estate argued he had breached multiple terms, uncompleted renovations, slipping maintenance, and most critically, wrote no financial capacity to preserve the estate. Andrew's lawyers fought back, claiming the rules were being selectively enforced. They argued this wasn't about contract law, it was punishment disguised as paperwork. But in reality, the legal details didn't matter anymore. The king had made his decision. For Charles, Royal Lodge had become a symbol, a test of whether the monarchy could discipline its own blood. For Andrew, it was the last fortress of identity he had left. And now it was collapsing. His daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, visited less, not out of coldness, but out of survival. They had their own children, their own reputations to protect. The love was still there, but loyalty had its limits. Outside the gates, public anger grew louder. Protesters demanded accountability. Commentators debated the king's firmness. Some called it ruthless, others said it wasn't nearly enough. Inside the lodge, Andrew drifted between defiance and despair. Some days he'd talk about legal battles, other days he'd barely leave his room. The grand house that once proved he mattered now just reminded him that he didn't. Royal Lodge was no longer a sanctuary. It was a countdown. The move didn't begin with flashing cameras. It began with silence. Staff who had served him for years started the sad choreography, wrapping photographs, folding uniforms, packing away medals from a life that would never return. Andrew watched from a distance, like a man watching his own history dissolve. Rooms once filled with furniture, laughter, and royal routine were now reduced to simple, brutal decisions. Take it, store it, leave it, throw it away. Sarah Ferguson, a veteran of public humiliation and comebacks, took control. She knew what collapse felt like, and she knew how to rebuild from ruins. She moved between rooms with quiet purpose, making lists, deciding what would fit in Frogmore Cottage's far smaller spaces. When Beatrice and Eugenie arrived, they held themselves together, but only for a moment. Seeing the little cottage in the garden, their childhood hideaway, broke them. This tiny playhouse had once been their escape, a place untouched by tabloids or scandal. Now it stood frozen in time, a relic of an innocence none of them could reclaim. Andrew said nothing. There was nothing left to say. When the removal trucks arrived, the world suddenly felt too visible again. Boxes stacked, furniture wrapped, paintings crated. The story of a prince was now reduced to an inventory list. Sarah urged him to leave, before the final truck pulled away, to spare him the sight of Royal Lodge becoming just an empty echo. The drive to Frogmore Cottage was short, barely 3 miles, but emotionally, it felt like crossing a lifetime. The cottage, neat and freshly painted, looked painfully small, 5 bedrooms instead of nearly 30. Cozy rooms that felt like corridors closing in. This was Harry and Meghan's former home, the symbolic residence of another royal exile. To Andrew, the symmetry felt cruel. At first night, unable to sleep, he sat alone in the kitchen at 3 a.m, staring into the dark. Not crying, not angry, just hollow. Royal Lodge was gone. And with it, the identity he had clung to for decades. Today, Royal Lodge stands empty. Furniture's gone, the photographs removed. Only echoes remain in the corridors of a once-loud home, but one question lingers. Who truly owns a royal house? The answer lies in a strange legal twilight. Royal Lodge belongs to the Crown Estate, a vast property portfolio that is neither private property nor standard government real estate. It exists in a constitutional gray area serving the monarchy, managed like a business, yet not owned by the monarch themselves. This arrangement dates back to 1760, when King George III surrendered revenue from royal lands in exchange for an annual payment from Parliament. That structure still shapes the monarchy today. For centuries, the system functioned quietly. Working royals lived in historic homes, and in return, they served the public. It was a symbolic exchange of privilege for duty. But Andrew broke that unspoken contract, continued living the royal lifestyle long after losing the royal role that justified it. The math no longer made sense. Claiming Royal Lodge was unjust about missed inspections. It was about redefining what royal privilege should mean in the 21st century. The public's instinct reflected that shift. People didn't object to William and Catherine living in Adelaide Cottage. They'd work. They'd serve. They'd represent the crown. But Andrew, at Royal Lodge, a man with no duties occupying a palace-sized home? The country saw a contradiction. And in a modern democracy, contradictions eventually collapse. Across the monarchy, each royal residence has its own set of rules. Clarence House for King Charles, Adelaide Cottage for William, Bagshot Park for Edward. Now, some are privately owned, some are leased, some are controlled by historic rules few truly understand. Andrew's fall from Royal Lodge forced those rules into the spotlight. And in doing so, it has forever changed how the world views royal housing, royal privilege, and royal consequences. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world.